Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal it began as an accident, an ordinary afternoon of searching through Brooke Lynn's cluttered office, filled with old Forrester papers, hospital memos, discarded draft lyrics, and medical documents that never seemed to make it to their proper filing cabinets. Rocco had no reason to linger, no suspicion of what he might find. But then, tucked within an unmarked manila folder, something caught his eye, a fragile birth certificate stamped with the name Benjamin Westbourne. His fingers brushed the page as if touching something sacred and forbidden. Beneath it lay a time-worn photograph, a younger Britt holding a newborn wrapped tightly in a pale blue blanket. Eyes wide and proud, posture maternal, intimate, familiar. An icy jolt shot through Rocco's chest. He stared at the image, then back at the name, over and over. The expression on Britt's face echoed something deep within his own childhood memories, something he could never quite place, until now. Confusion bled into dread. He turned the page, and then another. Medical forms, notes scrawled in Dante's distinctive handwriting. And a scattered trail of information led him into a darkness he hadn't known was hiding beneath the surface of his carefully curated identity. As the pieces connected with horrifying clarity, Rocco's pulse throbbed in his ears. His name, his full name, appeared in multiple notations next to Britt's, alongside coded references to embryo transfer, parental anonymity, and the name of a fertility clinic long shut down. It was as though someone had tried to erase the truth but had missed a few corners. Brooke Lynn had either found or assembled a mosaic of secrets no one had intended to be seen, least of all by Rocco himself. In a frantic search, Rocco continued flipping through folders until the undeniable became inescapable. He wasn't just born to Lulu and Dante, as he had always believed. He had been carried, birthed, and for a time raised by Britt, because Britt had stolen an embryo created by his supposed parents and implanted it into herself with the help of her mother, Liesel. That child, the one in the photo, the one named Benjamin Westbourne, was him. And everyone, had lied. Unable to breathe, Rocco slammed the drawer shut, clutching the folder as though it might disappear if he let it go. His hands shook with fury and betrayal as he marched straight to Lulu's house, barely remembering the walk there. What he needed in that moment was a lie, a soft, comforting lie that would tell him he had misunderstood. But Lulu didn't lie. When he confronted her with the evidence, with trembling anger and a voice hoarse with pain, she broke. The walls she had constructed so carefully collapsed with one whisper of the truth. Yes, Britt had carried him. Yes, Britt had stolen the embryo. And yes, Lulu and Dante had found out only after the fact, fighting a bitter battle to get him back. What Rocco heard, however, wasn't regret, it was betrayal. His life, built on a foundation of trust and love, now felt hollow, artificial, built on deception. Lulu tried to explain that she had protected him, that she had loved him fiercely since the day he came back into her arms. But for Rocco, none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence, the decision that he wasn't mature enough to handle the truth, the choice to strip him of the right to know his own origin story. He had worshipped Dante, modeled himself after the man he thought was a pillar of moral clarity. Now that image shattered, revealing a father who had known the truth and done nothing but pretend it didn't exist. It was the final wound. In the chaos of that confrontation, Rocco made a choice that would reverberate across every corner of Port Charles. He rejected Britt, not just in private, but unequivocally, publicly. And with a finality that felt more like an execution than a personal boundary. He refused to acknowledge her as his mother. He rebuffed every invitation, refused every note, dismissed every phone call, and refused to hear her name spoken in his presence. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a desperate, calculated attempt to amputate a part of himself that he now associated with shame, with manipulation, with stolen identity. In doing so, he set a chain reaction in motion that no one could stop. For Britt, it was the final undoing. She had spent years climbing out of the darkness of her past, rebuilding herself from the ashes of guilt and scandal. Every life saved, every moment of growth. Every apology given, she had clung to those as stepping stones toward redemption. But it all came crashing down in a single moment of rejection. The son she had once carried. The child who had been both her greatest mistake and her deepest longing, had declared that she was nothing to him. Britt shut down her clinic almost overnight, disconnected from the hospital. And vanished from the public eye. No one heard from her. Not a single patient, colleague, or friend. Her apartment went dark. Her mail piled up. She simply disappeared. It was Liesel who returned from Europe, sensing something was wrong. When she finally located her daughter, the sight that greeted her was harrowing. Britt, gaunt and vacant-eyed, sat in silence. Surrounded by remnants of a life she no longer believed she deserved. The apartment was frozen in time, untouched by warmth, her medical degrees collecting dust, her phone silenced and abandoned. Liesel checked her into a psychiatric facility under a pseudonym, desperate to keep the media and town gossip from further poisoning her daughter's fragile mind. The doctors diagnosed her with a major depressive episode brought on by unresolved guilt, abandonment, and trauma. She stopped speaking. She stopped eating. She became a shadow. Her brilliance dulled to embers. Back in Port Charles, Rocco's world had also turned cold. He left Lulu and Dante's home without warning, packed a bag, and moved into the Quartermain mansion with Gio, seeking distance not just from his parents, but from the version of himself they had created. He changed his phone number. He ignored his mother's pleas, his father's attempts to reach him. The boy who once smiled easily and carried the legacy of both the Spencer and Falconeri names now walked the halls of the Quartermain estate like a ghost. Even Gio, his newly discovered brother and confidant, couldn't reach the core of the pain Rocco was suppressing. The town quickly took notice. And what might have remained a private family implosion instead became the center of a public maelstrom. The community splintered. One faction denounced Britt and Liesel as monsters who had manipulated science and motherhood for personal gain. Another blamed Lulu and Dante for hiding the truth, arguing that they had weaponized silence to maintain control of their son's emotional loyalty. No one was spared from judgment. Brooklyn, inadvertently responsible for the discovery that detonated everything, found herself at the eye of the storm. Lulu, pushed past her limits, confronted her violently at Metro Court. She accused Brooklyn of meddling in matters she didn't understand. Brooklyn, unapologetic, claimed that the truth should never be buried. Their argument escalated to physical aggression, wine glasses shattered, furniture overturned, and security forced to intervene. Both women were banned from the premises. And the incident made the front page of the Port Charles Herald. Yet that spectacle was only the surface. Underneath the drama lay an unraveling that could not be contained. The hospital launched an investigation into Britt's medical practices. The licensing board reopened old cases. Rumors swirled about possible criminal charges. Rocco's therapy sessions became mandatory, court-ordered, and confidential. Liesel remained at her daughter's side, fiercely protective yet emotionally fraying. Dante, shattered by his son's rejection, began to spiral, missing shifts, forgetting court dates, and slowly unraveling the sense of order that had always defined him. Lulu stopped appearing in public. Her reputation tainted by whispers of secrecy and maternal manipulation. And through it all, Rocco drifted, lost in a sea of identities he never asked for, carrying a truth that offered no comfort. Only corrosion. He had torn away the mask, but what he found beneath it was not clarity, but ruin. And for all the chaos he had unearthed, all the bridges he had burned, there remained one cruel reality: the past could not be undone, only survived. And survival, in Port Charles, came at the highest cost imaginable. Rocco. Once known for his quiet confidence and grounded presence, now drifted through life with the haunted stillness of someone clinging to the edge of his own mind. After the unraveling of his identity and the volcanic rejection of the woman who had carried him into the world, he found himself lost in a fog of emotions too vast and complex to untangle. In a desperate attempt to regain control, or at least contain the rage and confusion boiling inside him, he reluctantly began therapy. On the outside, it was a step forward. He showed up to his appointments, filled out the intake forms, sat across from the psychologist with the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to hiding what truly hurt. But on the inside, he wasn't seeking healing. He wasn't looking to confront and process his trauma. He only wanted to forget. He wanted to bury every name, every face, every whispered truth that had shattered the story of who he believed he was. He didn't want closure, he wanted erasure. But memory has teeth. And for someone like Rocco, sharp, intuitive, emotionally layered, forgetting was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that birth certificate. Every time someone said the name Britt, it was like a shard of glass dragging across his skin. The pain that therapy tried to unpack only burrowed deeper, refusing to be disinfected by words or insight. And so, slowly, Rocco began to spiral. He withdrew from work obligations, missed rehearsals and social events, and let text messages go unanswered. His once disciplined life unraveled at the seams. Nights turned into a haze of alcohol and insomnia, his thoughts distorted by a cocktail of bitterness and regret. He drank not to numb the pain, but to punish himself for feeling it at all. Gio, still reeling from the chaos that had followed the nurse's ball and their unexpected familial bond, tried to remain close. He offered space when needed and companionship when possible, walking the tightrope of being a brother and a bystander. But their relationship, so new, so fragile, became another battlefield. Gio saw himself as partly responsible. If he hadn't searched for answers about their parents, if he hadn't encouraged the unraveling of secrets, maybe Rocco wouldn't have opened that file in Brooklyn's office. The guilt ate at Gio as much as the truth consumed Rocco. And in moments of silence between them, when words could no longer cushion the weight of what had been unearthed, they both retreated into themselves, estranged not by anger, but by the heaviness of grief neither knew how to carry. Elsewhere in Port Charles, the consequences of Rocco's rejection continued to reverberate with brutal force. Britt, already slipping through the cracks of her own identity, was found collapsed in her office. Pale and unresponsive, a trail of unfilled prescriptions and shredded letters scattered across her desk. Paramedics were called, but it was Liesel who took control. She had seen her daughter at her lowest before, but never like this. This wasn't just depression, it was complete psychic collapse. Britt had given up not only on others, but on herself. She had lost the will to speak, the desire to eat, the instinct to survive. Liesel checked her into a secure psychiatric unit under a private medical order, refusing to let Lulu or Dante visit, and forbidding their names to be mentioned in Britt's presence. To Liesel, the world had exacted its punishment on her daughter tenfold. She viewed Britt not as the perpetrator of an old crime, but as the most tragic casualty of it. And in her mind, Lulu and Dante were no longer the victims of a bioethical violation, but the architects of Britt's annihilation. Liesel became Britt's sole advocate, legal guardian, and emotional shield. She sat by her bedside each day, brushing her hair back from her face, whispering reassurances that fell on deaf ears. Liesel vowed to protect Britt, not just from the world, but from the institutions that now hovered over her like vultures waiting to feast. As the extent of Britt's mental and emotional decline became public, the legal machinery of Port Charles kicked into motion. A court was called to review Britt's medical and financial guardianship, questioning whether she remained competent enough to retain control over her estate or her medical license. After an emergency hearing, her medical practice was suspended indefinitely. The hospital board, unwilling to be tainted by association, distanced itself quickly, stripping Britt's name from plaques and official materials, citing reputational risk. The Medical Ethics Board reopened old case files regarding the embryo implantation, reviewing them in light of new testimony and public scrutiny. There were whispers that a member of the city council, who had long opposed Britt's return to medicine, was pushing for criminal proceedings, arguing that what Britt and Liesl had done years ago amounted not only to medical misconduct but moral depravity. Suddenly, the secret that had once lived in the quiet corners of Rocco's childhood became a political and social scandal. Media outlets revisited the past with brutal flair. Opinion pieces debated the ethics of assisted reproduction, consent, and identity theft. Former patients began asking if any of their treatments had ever crossed similar lines. And in the eye of the storm stood a shattered woman in a locked hospital room, a guilt-ridden mother trying to preserve what little dignity her daughter had left. And a young man, Rocco, who had accidentally unleashed it all in his search for truth. And what of Rocco? He wandered the wreckage he'd created with a hollow sense of purpose, knowing that the truth, once spoken, could never be unsaid. Each piece of fallout seemed to confirm what he feared the most, that some truths are better left buried. That the cost of honesty can be far more devastating than any lie. He no longer felt like a son to anyone. Not to Dante, who had become a stranger behind sad eyes. Not to Lulu, whose heartbreak now mirrored his own but whom he still couldn't forgive. Not to Britt, whose connection to him he had disavowed in a moment of clarity turned permanent. Therapy continued. But Rocco grew more withdrawn. He rarely spoke in sessions, often sitting in brooding silence, his eyes clouded with grief and rage. The psychologist noted signs of dissociation, symptoms of trauma-induced anxiety, and hinted that if left untreated, Rocco's downward spiral could manifest into self-harm or chronic depression. But Rocco didn't care. He didn't want to heal. He wanted silence, obliteration of memory, of ties, of name. The only thing tethering him to this world was his remaining bond with Gio, which now hung by a thread. As Port Charles divided into opposing camps and families fell into disarray, one truth became clear: there was no return to normalcy. The revelation had poisoned too much, broken too many people in ways that could not be undone. And within that wreckage, Rocco stood at a precipice with only two paths ahead: to forgive, not just Britt, but his parents and himself, or to continue denying the parts of his past that felt too painful to bear. But forgiveness was not easy. It required surrender. It required accepting that the people who had hurt him were also human, fallible, and wounded in their own right. And Rocco wasn't sure he was ready for that. Perhaps one day he would be. But for now, he chose silence. He chose stillness. He chose exile over reconciliation. And so, the tragedy of Rocco was no longer just a boy betrayed by biology. It was the slow unraveling of a soul caught between truth and identity, between survival and destruction. It was the warning to all who believe they can outrun the past, that even buried secrets rot from beneath the surface. That sometimes, the truth does not set you free. It swallows you whole. In the aftermath of a truth that fractured everything he believed about his origin, Rocco stood suspended between the weight of betrayal and the deafening silence of unresolved grief. The file he discovered had not just revealed a hidden past, it had detonated every illusion of safety, love, and belonging he once clung to. The fallout wasn't limited to the unraveling of family ties or the collapse of long-held relationships, it seeped into every crevice of his identity, leaving him unmoored and restless. Therapy offered no comfort, because Rocco didn't want understanding, he wanted forgetfulness. But the human heart does not forget on command. And so, trapped in the purgatory between memory and denial, he began to sabotage himself. He drank to escape, but the emptiness only echoed louder. He isolated himself from the people who loved him, but found no comfort in solitude. Even his relationship with Gio, the one new bond forged from the ruins, became strained, caught in the crossfire of guilt and resentment. Meanwhile, The collapse of Britt marked a tragic parallel descent. Once a woman fighting tirelessly for redemption, she now floated in a state of mental suspension, institutionalized, unresponsive. And stripped of every professional and personal title she had worked to reclaim. Her rejection by Rocco had been the final blow, irrevocable, merciless, and complete. Lethal. In her desperation to protect what remained of her daughter, barred Lulu and Dante from contact, redirecting her fury toward the world that had deemed Britt unworthy of forgiveness. But the world was already circling like vultures. The hospital revoked Britt's license, the court questioned her competence. And whispers of reopened legal cases against her and Liesel flooded the city. What had once been a family secret had now become a public indictment, dragging reputations, institutions, and even medical ethics into the storm. And through it all, Britt remained lost within herself, the girl who once dreamed of being loved now existing only as a cautionary tale. Yet in the stillness that followed the chaos, something deeper lingered, an invitation not yet accepted, a lesson not yet learned. Rocco's suffering was not just the tragedy of a boy who had been lied to. It was the tragedy of a world that thought silence could protect, that believed some truths were too dangerous to confront. But in the end, the lie had done more harm than the truth ever could. As he walked the halls of the Quartermain mansion, aimless and hollow, the question remained. Would he ever find the courage to forgive, not for them, but for himself? That decision, like all healing, would not come swiftly or easily. But the mere fact that he still breathed, still woke up each morning, still stood beneath the weight of it all, meant there was hope. Not the naive kind that wished away pain, but the hardened hope that blooms quietly in ruins. Perhaps. In time, Rocco would learn that survival is its own act of defiance. And perhaps, just perhaps, healing begins not with forgetting, but with facing what hurts and choosing to live anyway.